And also I am to be the breadwinner. 1 Timothy 5 verse 8. If any man provide not for his own, especially them of his own household, he's worse. He's denied the faith. He's worse than an infidel, because even an unbeliever will look after his wife and family. An unbeliever will go to work and work hard all day and bring home some money to put food on the table. There are Christian men who are lazy bum. That should not be true. The second thing, and I might not get to the third thing this morning, but the second thing is obedience. The first ingredient to a happy marriage is God. And the second ingredient to a happy marriage is obedience. And so because God is first in my life, I'm committed to obey His commands concerning my marriage. Well, what are some of the commands that we find in the Bible? We could call these ground rules. And there's actually very specific things that God has commanded. Many times they're different. Some of them are the same, but some of them there's a different emphasis. Now let's go back to Ephesians 5 for just a moment. Again, we're going to get into this in more detail. I'm just throwing this out that right now that we have to be prepared to do what God tells us to do. So as we come back to Ephesians 5 and verse 22, it says, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord." And again, the relationship with the Lord is there as unto the Lord. I want to please the Lord, and so I'm submitting to the Lord. Well, God says, as you submit to me, I want you... God is speaking now, and God says, I want you, wife, to submit yourself unto your own husband. Now, that's a command from God for wives to obey. Another command in verse 33 is that the wife see that she reverence her husband. You know, one of the worst things you can do with your husband is to not respect him. Now, we could talk about never, ever denigrate your husband in public. Never criticize your husband in public. You shouldn't get with your girlfriends and spill all the dirt about your husband. That's going to affect your spirit. It's going to affect their relationship to your husband whenever they see him. And there's going to be a whole negative vibe there that comes because you're criticizing your husband to others publicly. But actually, even in your relationship with just the two of you, you should reverence your husband, respect your husband, even in private. If you treat your husband and talk to your husband like as a dog, and I've seen it and I've heard it, and the wife does not respect her husband, you are driving a wedge between him and you, because one of the keys in a man's heart is he desires respect, especially from his wife. Now, he may not even deserve that respect half the time, but you don't have to tell him that. The Bible says, submit yourselves to your husbands and reverence your husbands, respect your husband, and speak well of him. When you're in public, speak well of him. When you're with him, respect him. Now, you may have to deal with some things, or it might not be in your heart to, maybe there's a real problem. We'll get to communications later on. But you see, you have a relationship with God, and it is God that says, reverence your husband. It is God that says, submit yourself to your husband. Because of your love for him, you're going to do it even if you don't feel like it. But you know what? If you do that, and obeying that command, you are so helping yourself, because you are going to make a better husband out of him if you follow what the Bible says. Now, if you rebel against him, and you're domineering, and he's henpecked, and he knows he's henpecked, and everybody in his community knows he's henpecked, and he's disrespected, and you don't reverence him, you're destroying your marriage. Makes you feel good, yeah, but it's going to bite you. Sacrifice first, submit yourself, reverence your husband. These are just simple ground rules we find here right on the surface. Then in verse 25, and it goes back and forth, you see, between the husbands and the wife. Verse 25, he says, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it. Now, the word love there's two primary words in the New Testament for love. One is phileo, which is an affection. And that's when you get all the gushy feelings, is phileo. It's a friendliness, it's a brotherly affection. Like Philadelphia, okay, like Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. Philadelphia means brotherly love. Delphos is brother. Phile is love. So Philadelphia is brotherly love. That comes from the phileo. It's the affectionate kind of love. That's not the love that is used here. This word is the different word. It's agape love. Agape is an action word. Agape is doing the right thing by the person no matter what you're feeling emotionally. For God so loved the world. That was an action. He gave His only begotten Son. And husbands are to love their wives, even as Christ also loved the church. Christ loves us that way. We don't deserve His love. Well, I'm not going to love my wife because she doesn't do the right thing. Well, here we are as the church. Do we do the right thing? And yet Jesus still loves us with that sacrificial love. And He gave Himself for it. The Bible says that we are to, as husbands, to give ourselves to our wives. And the emotion might not even be there. People say, well, I don't love her anymore. What does that mean? What do you mean you don't love her anymore? Well, you don't have the gushy feelings that you had when you were dating her. Well, join the club. I mean, I remember when Leslie and I would date and we would sit on the bench at Tennessee Temple and our pupils just went boom, just dilated. Have you ever seen that? Do you remember that? Does that still happen? Maybe not. See, God gives that's how people get together. You know, if it wasn't for that, maybe there wouldn't be anything called marriage because we'd be just doing our own thing. But there's an attraction, you see, especially in youth, when you come together. You know, all those romantic feelings and all. And that's great. And by the way, we're going to be talking about more about that later on when you're married for 40 years. By the way, it's even better. It's much better now than it was even back then. Okay? But what I'm saying is, people say, well, the emotion's gone. So therefore, I don't love her anymore, so I'm going to get divorced. That's a lot of nonsense. That's not what love is. Love is a commitment. No matter what you're feeling, you're going to do the right thing. And you're committed to this person. And one of the things that makes that ironclad is because I'm first of all committed to Him. I want to do right by God. And if I want to do right by God, then I'm going to do what He tells me to do. I'm going to obey His commandments, and I'm going to love my wife sacrificially, even if she's fell out with me. And she's read me the riot act. I don't have the right to just storm off and do my own thing. No, I have a responsibility to love my wife always. By the way, it's repeated in verse 33. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife even as himself. You're to love your wife as yourself. Now, we're going to get into a wee bit more of that here in another passage. And he talks about the children. These are commands to obey. Verse 1 of chapter 6, children, obey your parents. You want a happy home? Children have to obey. Children have to respect. They got to do what their mom and daddy says. And if, as a parent, now this is getting ahead of ourselves, but as a parent, if you don't demand obedience from your children, now all kids are going to make mistakes, I'm not talking about that. And you shouldn't even spank your children if they're just making mistakes. But when they in defiance rebel against you and they are disobedient and they're testing your will, you have to win that fight. And you have to win that fight, I think, before they're 5 years old. Because it's a different fight at 15 years old. But we'll get into that later on. But then also the fathers in verse 4. He says, this is chapter 6, and ye fathers provoke not your children unto wrath. Fathers are not to provoke their children. You've got to be reasonable with your children. You've got to be godly with your children. What would Jesus do? Now this is basic stuff. But God expects obedience to these commandments. And I'm telling you, you disregard these commands at your peril. You say, well, this is just preaching. No, I'm telling you, you've got to do exactly what He says in the blueprint. And if you do, even though it doesn't feel right at the time, and you don't see the fruit of it at the time, if you keep obeying those commands, you'll reap what you've sown. And it'll be a blessing, it'll be happy. But you neglect those things, and you fudge those things, and you say, well, I don't care, he did this on me, and I'm not going to respect him for that. I'm telling you, you're playing with fire, because it'll hurt you. And not only will it hurt him, it'll hurt you in the end. So there's things that we are responsible for as individuals, as a man, as a husband. I'm responsible for some things that she's not responsible for. She's responsible for some things that I'm not responsible for. So let's just talk about that briefly, and I won't get to point 3. We'll get to that next time. Husbands. According to 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3, you're the head of your home. Just as God is the head of Christ, and Christ is the head of the man, and the man is the head of the woman. Now, Christ and God are equal, but Christ has submitted himself for the purpose of God unto the Father. The husband and the wife are equal. You could say that the wives are unequal in many things. They're better than the husbands in many, and that's the truth of it. But in the sight of God, the husband and wife are equal. Eve was taken from Adam's side, not from his head, not from his foot, from his side. We are equal. But in the plan of God, the wife is to submit herself because of the will of God, to the headship of her husband. That's Bible. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3. And so Christ has submitted himself to the will of the Father. And so the wife is to submit herself to her husband. The point I'm making here is that the husband is the head, he's the leader, and he's responsible. Do you know who's responsible for your marriage and your home and your children? It's not the mommy, it's the daddy. Many times the daddy leaves all the chastening to the mother. It's not good. The father's responsible. And the father should be the teacher in the home and the leader in the home. The husband is somebody who looks after something. An animal husbandry is someone who looks after his animals. Well, I'm a husband. What does that mean? It means I'm responsible to take care of something. Amen. And that something is someone. It's my wife. Now, I'm not a husband to my children. I'm a father to my children. That's a different relationship. But God has given me a responsibility to look after my wife. Now, I want to go back to Ephesians because it talks about this here in 1 Timothy 5. And let me see here. Getting ahead of myself. Look down at verse 29. In fact, look at verse 28. So it meant to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. You see that? Because it's going to boomerang back. If you don't take care of your wife, you're hating yourself because you're going to make a misery for yourself. If I love my wife, I'm helping myself. And he says, you're to love your wife as you love yourself. And he said that down in verse 33. In particular, so love his wife even as himself. I'm to love Leslie as I would love me. I take good care of me. I'm a husband to myself. I look after me all right. If I'm hungry, what do? I go looking for something to eat. If I'm cold, what do? I go get a coat. If I'm out in the weather, what do? I seek shelter and come in out of the cold. Notice what he says in verse 29. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. Here's another example. Not only does a man look after himself, but the Lord looks after his church. And just like the Lord looks after his church, and I look after myself, and to look after my wife. Good. Now, there's two words here. The word nourish. You know what the word nourish means? It means to feed. You see the word cherish, it means to keep warm. So there's two responsibilities to have initially to my wife, and that is I've got to feed her. And so that would be food initially, right? But that would be everything that she needs. If she says to me, I don't have enough pots in my kitchen, that's my responsibility. I'm going to get her every pot and frying pan that she needs. But if whatever she needs, I nourish her. By the way, not just physically, but emotionally. If she is depressed, if she's discouraged, that's my responsibility. I got to minister to my wife. I've got to feed her. I've got to nourish her. Everything. But I've got to put a roof over her head. You know, the Bible says, I am to provide for my house. Now, we'll get into this later on. But not only that, it's the emotional cherishing. When was that? Was that this morning? I shouldn't talk about this. Was that this morning you were cool? So I'm sitting on the recliner, getting stuff ready for this morning. And she says, I'm cold. And she climbs into my recliner. I know I'm embarrassing her. She climbs, two of us in this recliner. God help the little recliner. And she close, and I cuddle with her. I said, come here. And I cherish her. I love that. I'm warming her up physically, but it's more than that, isn't it? There's that affection, that closeness, that intimacy. And by the way, it's not just about sexual relationship. It's about that closeness, that relationship, that intimacy, to nourish, to cherish. Those are things that are my responsibility. Now, we can get into this in more detail later on, but what I'm saying is, I've got to be obedient to these things. These are ground rules. These are responsibilities that I have as a husband. I'm to nourish her. I'm to cherish her. I'm to honor her as the weaker vessel. You know, it's not just that the wives respect the husbands. The husband's got to respect the wives. And I've got to look out for her. And I've got to look out for her emotionally. And if she's putting herself in a situation where she's being stressed and depressed, that's me. That's my responsibility. To find that out and to try to alleviate that, take the stress off, take the pressure off, because I'm responsible. I'm her husband. I'm to look after her. And also I am to be the breadwinner. 1 Timothy 5 verse 8. If any man provide not for his own, especially them of his own household, he's worse. He's denied the faith. He's worse than an infidel, because even an unbeliever will look after his wife and family. An unbeliever will go to work and work hard all day and bring home some money to put food on the table. There are Christian men who are lazy bum. That should not be true. Listen, your wife's not to keep you, you're to keep her. I know we've all got different abilities and tasks and so on, but I know there are Christian men who are lazy. They're capped. I knew many of them in Northern Ireland. It's not right. They're not being obedient to what the Bible says.